She's the Swedish youth activist who dares to take on world leaders to act on climate change. But is there still time? I'll ask Nobel Peace Prize nominee Greta Thunberg. I'm Marc Lamont Hill. Also on the show, in just a handful of years, the far-right conspiracy theory QAnon has moved beyond online chat rooms in the U.S. and into the mainstream, with elements even entering the hallways of power. And now it's gotten even bigger, with followers in Brazil, Germany, Japan, and the UK. We'll discuss how the cult went global in this week's arena. But first, her message to global leaders and governments is simple. Listen to the science and treat climate change like the crisis it is. But few are listening. So what's next? I'll ask this week's headliner, activist Greta Thunberg. Greta Thunberg, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
2 years ago, you famously addressed world leaders about climate change. You said, "I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear that I feel every day." It's now 2021, and quite frankly, very little has been done. Few, if any, governments seem to be panicking. How does that make you feel?
Well, I mean, first of all, when I say I want them to panic, that's of course a metaphor. I don't want them to literally panic. That wouldn't be very useful. But by panic, I mean I want them to act with the urgency and to realize that this is an existential crisis. And they are obviously not doing that. But I hadn't expected that either, so I can't say that I'm disappointed. Because as long as the crisis is not treated as a crisis, as long as we are not communicating this crisis as a crisis, of course, the response will not be a crisis response.
What are they not getting? What are world leaders and governments missing?
Well, just basically any sign, any sense of urgency. And I mean, of course, it varies from one person to another, but it seems like overall we are sort of getting the time frame very wrong. We are talking about targets in like 2030, 2040, or 2050 when we need targets for now. The emissions need to start reducing right now because it's today that the carbon budget is being used up. And just the fact that that sense of time is lacking basically says it all.
You talk about awareness being key to affecting more action. But let's be honest, world leaders have known what's at stake for a long time. They've known about the dangers of climate change for decades. The U.S. government has known about it since the 70s. They haven't done anything. We could say the same for companies like Exxon. They have ignored it, largely in pursuit of profit. So it seems to me that awareness isn't enough, is it?
Of course not. You need. I mean, we can hammer people with facts. We can say like this is how our carbon dioxide budget looks like, and this is how much natural habitat we have lost, and this is how much the planet has warmed, and so on. And of course that's necessary, yes, and that's not being communicated enough in media. But we cannot just do that. We need to communicate that in a way that also sends a signal that this is a crisis. If I, for instance, were to tell you that our house is on fire, this is an existential crisis, and we must take action now, and then just go on living like before, not doing anything specific, just talking about these things, that doesn't send a signal that something is wrong. Humans are social animals. We copy each other's behavior. If no one is acting as if we were in a crisis, then of course that we will not draw that conclusion that we are in a crisis. So we need to tell the facts, yes, spread awareness, but also do it in a way that signals that this is a crisis.
Doing it in a way that signals this is a crisis, for some that means disruptive, direct action, similar to what groups like Extinction Rebellion have done. Is that the solution here? Are we at the stage where that's the kind of response we need?
I mean, as long as the action doesn't do more harm than good, I would say that any action is welcome. We are right now at a stage where we cannot sort of talk about going vegan is better than stop flying, and like having this discussion of what's better than. Right now we need to do everything that we possibly can, and that is possible from our own circumstances and situations.
Let's talk a little bit about flying. You, of course, have led the charge against flying to reduce the negative impact of airplanes on the environment. You have even led by example, traveling to conferences by sea instead of air. But ultimately, are enough people following your lead? Even in the middle of a pandemic, we see people jet setting. Many people find global travel, and particularly through airplanes, to be second nature. It's how the world operates. Is it realistic to expect to make any kind of dent in air travel? Is it a worthwhile fight even?
Of course not. Of course it's not realistic for people to reduce their flights and to stop flying, because let's face it, the climate crisis doesn't exist in the public debate. And I'm not telling people to stop flying. I'm not telling people to fly less. So it's funny that is something that people make up for themselves. I have never told anyone that people shouldn't be flying. That's just something I don't fly myself, and then people think that I'm telling people not to fly because they feel guilty themselves because I don't fly. And I didn't sail across the Atlantic Ocean to reduce my carbon footprint. That would be quite pathetic, actually. But I did it, of course, to start a debate and to send a signal, like I told earlier, that something is wrong, that we are in a crisis, and that something drastic needs to change. And to also show that it is impossible to live sustainable today.
Greta, do you worry that could be counterproductive in some way? That if you take a measure that some see as so unrealistic that they become dismissive of climate change activists, that they say, look, they're asking us to do unreasonable things, there's no point in me even engaging this conversation. Do you have any concern about that?
You can see it in different ways. I see my role is to highlight the dissonance between what we are saying and what we are doing, and what needs to be done. And some say that since nothing is happening, this is just so hopeless. But I think it's the opposite. We are right now at a point where it's so clear that nothing is happening. It's so obvious that you cannot deny it anymore. A few years ago, you could say, yeah, but many people are doing something. But right now, the science is so crystal clear, and the picture is getting clearer and clearer that you cannot anymore deny that we are actually ignoring this crisis. And that, I think, is hopeful. So that's what I'm trying to do, to sort of... The gap is widening by the minutes, and what I am doing is try to highlight and visualize that gap.
Well, one place where you have certainly been effective is at home. You've influenced your own mother. She was a celebrated opera singer who actually stopped touring because of the flying involved. Most people can't convince their parents of anything. How did you do it, and how can other teenagers follow your lead and really make an impact in their immediate surroundings?
Well, in the beginning, I don't think, I know that she didn't do it for the climate's sake, because, obviously, to be frank, she didn't care about the environment nor the climate, just like everyone else seems to. But I started caring, and I started to feel bad because I saw everything that was happening, and that made me depressed, that I know many others are also feeling. And then she saw that when she did something to sort of, even if it was just recycling or something, that made me happy. And they saw that I started to feeling better when they started to do things. And then I was really annoying, I must say. Just keep showing them graphs and like reports, this is how much the impact of aviation is, and this is how much this and that. And then I sort of made her stop flying, and then she saw how happy that made me, and I guess that meant more to her than her career, which is yeah.
You mentioned that she saw you depressed. You know, some people throw that word around, but you literally went into a deep depression after being introduced to this issue at the age of 11. You simply couldn't understand how the issue could be so clear, and yet the world didn't seem to care very much about it. You've done lots of work since then. You have literally helped to change the national and international conversation on climate change, and yet there's still so much inaction. There's still so many people who don't care. There's so many people who don't respond the way you'd like. How do you deal with that now at the emotional level? Do you still struggle with depression around this issue?
No. I mean, when you start doing things, that's the antidote for depression, because then you don't have time to feel depressed anymore. But I mean, you cannot just allow yourself to feel depressed or to just think about everything negative in the world. You just have to live. I mean, if you are doing everything you can, you just have to live in the moment and realize that, okay, I'm doing everything I can. There's nothing more I can do. And then you just have to be happy. So yeah, that's what I'm doing. And the media has some kind of, or people have some kind of misconception. They think that I and other teenagers are scared and angry. And at least for me and for the people I know, that's not the case. I mean, we are, because we feel very motivated by the activism. This is what makes us feel, it gives us a meaning in life, and a meaning in life makes you happy.
Let's pivot a little bit, because I'd like to talk to you about some of the false, what some call the false solutions around climate change. Market-based solutions like cap and trade, which set a cap on emissions from big industries, but then allows companies to buy and sell carbon permits to pollute. Many believe that the market mechanisms or solutions touted by industry ultimately just benefit the market and it won't ultimately help the planet. It makes many of us wonder if big money, if moneyed interests have co-opted the movement. Can we do real environmental work against the backdrop of capitalism?
I mean, that's not for me to say. It may be possible. It may not be possible. I think that should not be our main focus. I mean, we are discussing, like, can we have green growth? And we are so obsessed with that conversation. And maybe we can, maybe we cannot. I mean, I don't care, to be honest. I just want a livable planet.
But let's at least drill down just a little bit on the question of big money. Have moneyed interests co-opted the movement? That's sort of an objective question that we can look at to decide how to save the planet.
Of course, there's so much lobbyism going on that it's, I mean, in all movements, and they are trying to profit from this and to sort of greenwash. Greenwashing is a huge problem. So yeah, that is a huge problem.
As we all know, it's the industrialized world that has contributed so greatly to the degradation of the environment through decades and decades of unsustainable practices. What do you say to people in the developing world who say, hey, it's our turn to develop in the same ways as these other countries did?
I mean, that's true. That's so true. And I have nothing to argue against that. And that just puts even more responsibility to us in this part of the world to actually lead, because we've built our welfare by building infrastructure and by doing so emitting carbon dioxide. And who are we to tell people in developing countries that you cannot have the same, you cannot live as we are doing? The Paris Agreement will never work if the aspect of equity is not at the heart of the way we address this. And
is there any danger in by taking that approach that we let developing countries completely off the hook and they engage in practices that are not only unsustainable, but also that compromise the bigger picture goal of reversing course?
Of course, there are risks in everything, but we talk about China a lot and India. I mean, how can we expect countries like that to actually take action if we in this part of the world don't lead the way, which we have actually signed up to do in the Paris Agreement? Negotiations have been taking place for decades, and the Paris Agreement was some kind of compromise to make sure that was like the thing that they came up with, sort of. But of course, that's far from ideal as well.
Right. You talk about things that are far from ideal. I think about the global response to you from some of your critics. I mean, your activism has angered some pretty powerful people, world leaders like former U.S. President Trump, Russian President Vladimir Putin, of course, Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, who went so far as to even call you a brat. I mean, you've had insults and abuse hurled your way. What does it say to you, though, that fully grown adults who are supposed to be statesmen seem to be threatened by you and resort to personal attacks?
It's very fun. It's a great entertainment, I can tell. it's as if they seriously think that that would demotivate us. I mean, that just fuels us even more, because that shows that we are having an impact and that we are making change. So that is having the opposite effect.
Does it ever hurt, though? I mean, I know sometimes we frame these things as purely political, and we say we don't take them personally, but we're people, right? I mean, is it ever challenging when these powerful people are hurling such vitriol at you?
I mean, not really, because I can distance myself from that. But as an autistic person, I don't like when people are telling lies. I want everything to be correct. I cannot lie. So it's quite like sometimes annoying when people spread conspiracy theories, but also that's also very fun. But it's like when people take like quotes from me and make them false, and like, I've never said that, I've never done that. That makes like, just because it's morally wrong for people to do that, you should not lie. But yeah, that's another thing, I guess.
Before you go, what do you say to people who say Greta Thunberg should stay in the activist lane for climate change only? You're speaking out about free speech in India. You've said that Alexei Navalny should be released in Russia. You seem to be wading into other waters now. And some people say just focus on climate activism. What do you say to those people?
Well, I never engage in politics. I never speak up about politics. I really try not to speak up about politics. But some things are beyond politics, like basic fundamental human rights. It's the only right thing to do. I mean, if you don't, some things you cannot be silent about, simply.
Greta, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much.
A conspiracy-based online cult based on worshiping an anonymous leader known as Q, extreme reverence for former U.S. President Donald Trump, and a belief that the world is being run by a global trafficking network that drinks the blood of children. If you live in the U.S., you probably know I'm talking about QAnon, a movement which has grown throughout the country in recent years and had many followers involved in the January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol, aimed at keeping Trump in power. But QAnon has also gained traction across the globe. From Japan to Brazil, Germany, and the United Kingdom, followers of the cult continue to spread conspiracies and disinformation beyond U.S. politics. So what is it about QAnon that has allowed it to take root overseas? To help us answer this question, we're joined by Melanie Smith, the head of analysis at Graphika, where she studies online social movements and disinformation, and Miro Dittrich, who monitors right-wing populism and extremism in Germany. Thank you both for joining me in the arena. Melanie, I'm going to start with you. QAnon supporters thought that in the final days of Donald Trump's presidency that he would declare martial law, that his political opponents like Joe Biden would be carried out in handcuffs, that it would be a great awakening. Now, you'll be shocked to know that none of that happened. Instead, Donald Trump and many of his QAnon supporters were deplatformed after January 6th. How do they make sense of all of that? This gap between the grand predictions and what's actually happened in real life?
I think there's a lot of confusion and there's a lot of disappointment from QAnon supporters and also from leaders in the movement who really thought that this prophecy was going to come true, that Donald Trump would be reelected and that Democrats would be led to Guantanamo Bay in handcuffs. Obviously, none of that has happened. So what we're kind of seeing now is the QAnon movement try to reconstitute itself around a different set of conspiracy theories and rely more heavily on theories that were within the movement before but don't necessarily revolve around Trump.
And is there a sense from you that what's happening overseas in terms of how this is played out post-January 6th is different than how it's played out in the United States in terms of how they make sense of it or how they're responding to it?
I think the QAnon communities that we've seen spring up in places outside of the US are less tied to political outcomes. QAnon communities in places like Japan are less reliant on that. Typically, the communities that we've seen spring up in European countries are very closely tied to COVID-19 conspiracies and disinformation, and obviously that hasn't come to an end just yet.
Miro, talk to me about the German context. I mean, Germany has the largest community of non-English speaking QAnon supporters. Some are estimating this number at over 200,000.
We definitely seen from the beginning that the pandemic was the most important event QAnon had a German presence, but it was really slow. But until last March, we saw this huge explosion. So the biggest platform for QAnon in Germany is Telegram, and the biggest channel had 20,000 subscribers. And now the biggest channels are up to 160,000 people following them. So it was very pandemic focused. But over the turn of the US election, it was really focused on President Trump. And it was really interesting to see, while the broader far-right spectrum kept talking about issues in Germany, that even the pandemic that's happening in Germany wasn't really the main topic. They were all focused on the election and how this election was supposedly stolen.
I think what's fascinating to me, and what I'm frankly struggling to understand fully, is how mainstream this is in Germany. You've had Angela Merkel's centrist Christian Democrats union in power for over 15 years with the far-right AfD, the Alternative for Germany party, at fairly fringe levels of popularity in polls and elections. I guess my question is that changing? And what are the conditions in Germany that have allowed these kinds of movements to grow?
I think what we see in this focus on QAnon is that it's a level of frustration and of desperation. Because if your only way forward, if your only way for salvation is a one-time transformative event that's organized from the outside, it pretty clearly tells you about what you think you can do on your own. So I think there's a lot of frustration in the conspiracy ideologue and in the far-right scene in Germany.
Melanie, I'm curious about the QAnon world in Japan, where I believe there's an almost worshiping of Trump's former national security advisor, General Michael Flynn, and a belief that Flynn gave former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe all the information required to unravel the deep state in the United States. I don't mean to mock it, it's just genuinely shocking to me how this kind of ideology plays out. Please explain this to me, how this happens.
I'm not sure if I can explain it fully, but I can kind of describe some of those theories. There's a faction of Japanese support for QAnon that is very closely tied to General Michael Flynn. It's to do with his time as a national security advisor and the kind of role that he played between the Japanese and US governments at the time. Flynn was kind of primed to become this intermediary between the two governments, and the conspiracy theory kind of goes that there was a diplomatic meeting where, you're right, there was information supposedly exchanged between Flynn and Shinzo Abe, and that his resignation actually came in the wake of that meeting after a kind of diplomatic summit between the two countries. So there is that belief for some of the Japanese QAnon community, but not necessarily all of it.
So I know that there are some distinguishing characteristics in each place, but is there a thread that cuts across all of these contexts, whether it's a set of conditions, a set of vulnerabilities that allows these types of beliefs in general to take hold?
Sure. I think at its core, it's an anti-government conspiracy theory and an anti-establishment conspiracy theory. So there aren't necessarily any specific vulnerabilities other than disenfranchisement and feeling like there's a lack of representation and a lack of your kind of true beliefs in government. I think what we've seen, particularly in Europe, is that QAnon conspiracy theories have really taken off in communities that did already exist around anti-government conspiracy theories, political conspiracy theories. In the UK, it's been very closely tied to a big conspiracy theory about human trafficking. But the overwhelming theme for me really is disenfranchisement and a lack of representation.
Would you agree with that, Miro? I'm looking at Brazil. There's a very distinct pro-Bolsonaro flavor to their movement. I'm thinking about France, I'm thinking about the UK. Is it just a kind of disposition against government? Are there other vulnerabilities we should be thinking about? Are there other threads that cut across all of these places in your estimation?
I think what connects a lot of these movements, not just QAnon, but similar far-right conspiracy ideologies, is that a lot of people in this more and more fragmented world have a real loss of community. They don't have the classical communities around them as society offered them. So these online communities are something they are looking for. And on the other hand, I think what really lacks to a lot of people right now is a sense of purpose. They say they're missing a great narrative. Why are they living for? And I think these cults, these conspiracy ideologies help them they give them this mission, and they are fighting this international fight from good against evil in the world. And I think it's really sad because the human want for communities and the human want for purpose, I think, is a really good one. And it's sad that these people don't seem to get better offers from our societies right now than these conspiracy ideologues.
All right. Thank you both for joining me. And that's our show. We'll see you next week.